I never meant to walk into his house that day. It all started as an innocent mistake, an act of neighborly concern. My husband had left for a business trip early that morning, and I was spending yet another lonely day at home, cleaning and half-heartedly scrolling through social media. Around noon, I heard a strange noise from my neighbor's house. At first, I thought it was just the plumbing acting up, but when the sound continued a steady rush of water, it got me worried. Mr. Ben had lived next door for years, recently widowed and living alone. He was a kind man who always seemed to have a quiet dignity about him. My husband and I had exchanged pleasantries with him over the years, but I wouldn't say we were close. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that something might be wrong. Perhaps he had slipped or fallen. His front door was slightly ajar, which heightened my concern. I knocked softly, calling out, "Mr. Bennett, are you all right?" There was no response. I hesitated, feeling uneasy about entering someone's home without permission, but the sound of running water grew louder, and my imagination spiraled. What if he was unconscious? What if he needed help? I stepped inside, my heart racing. The living room was neat and quiet, with only the faint scent of aftershave lingering in the air. Following the noise, I walked toward the bathroom. The door was opened just a crack, enough for steam to drift into the hallway. "Mr. Bennett," I called again, louder this time. And then I saw him. He stood under the shower, his back turned to me, the water cascading over his broad shoulders. The bathroom mirror, fogged up with steam, reflected just enough for me to take in the scene. Without meaning to, my breath caught in my throat as I froze, mortified by my mistake. Before I could retreat, he turned slightly, catching sight of me through the mirror. His eyes widened in surprise, but instead of anger or embarrassment, there was something calm in his expression. He quickly grabbed a towel, wrapping it around his waist as he stepped out of the shower. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, my cheeks burning. I heard the water and thought something was wrong. He chuckled softly, a low, comforting sound. "No harm done. I should have locked the door. You were just being kind." His response disarmed me. Most people would have been annoyed, but he seemed almost amused. There was no awkwardness in the way he stood there, water dripping from his silver-streaked hair. If anything, his composure made me feel even more flustered. "I'll leave," I mumbled, backing away. I didn't mean to intrude. But as I turned, he said gently, "Wait. Thank you for checking on me. It's nice to know someone cares." His words lingered with me long after I returned home. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment, a harmless encounter, but deep down, I knew something had shifted. The days following that moment were marked by a strange mix of curiosity and unease. I avoided crossing paths with Mr. Bennett, feeling too embarrassed to face him, yet I couldn't get the image of him out of my mind. It wasn't just the way he looked, it was his calmness, his kindness. He hadn't been angry or uncomfortable, just understanding. One afternoon, as I was pruning the bushes in my backyard, his voice startled me. "Looks like you've got a green thumb," he said with a smile, leaning against the fence that separated our yards. My first instinct was to mumble something and retreat, but his friendly tone disarmed me. "It's more of a battle than a skill," I replied, forcing a light laugh. He chuckled and leaned closer. "You're doing better than I would. My wife was the one with the talent for these things." His expression softened, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "I've let most of her plants go. Couldn't keep up with them." There was a vulnerability in his voice that made me pause. "I could help if you want," I offered, the words leaving my mouth before I could think. And so it began. The following days turned into a routine of sorts. I'd spend an hour or two in his yard, helping him tend to overgrown shrubs and neglected flower beds. He would join me, sharing stories about his late wife, his years working as a teacher, and the travels he had always planned but never quite got around to. His voice had a way of drawing me in, warm and steady like the hum of a comforting tune. At first, it felt purely innocent, two neighbors sharing a connection, but the way he looked at me sometimes lingered longer than it should. I noticed the way his gaze softened when I laughed, the way his hand would brush mine when we worked side by side, and I couldn't deny the way my heart skipped when it happened. One afternoon, as we stood admiring the newly tidied garden, he handed me a glass of lemonade. Our fingers touched briefly, and I felt a jolt, as if the air between us had shifted. For a moment, neither of us moved. "You've done more for this place than I have in years," he said softly, his eyes fixed on mine. "It's nothing," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. "It's not nothing," he said, and there was something in his tone that made my breath catch. I looked away, trying to laugh it off. "Well, maybe you just needed a little help. Or maybe I just needed someone to remind me how much life there still is to enjoy," he said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. I didn't know how to respond to that. A part of me wanted to pull away, to remind myself that I was married, that this was just neighborly kindness, but another part of me felt drawn to him, unable to ignore the spark between us. The evening it all changed was quiet, with a light rain pattering against the windows. My husband had called earlier, saying his trip would be extended by another week. I feigned understanding on the phone, but deep down, I felt the growing weight of loneliness pressing against my chest. I hadn't planned on going to Mr. Bennett's that night, but somehow, I found myself standing at his door, holding a plate of cookies I'd baked to distract myself. When he opened the door, his smile was warm, his eyes lighting up with surprise. "For me?" he asked, gesturing to the cookies. "Just thought you might like something sweet," I said, feeling foolish but unable to step away. He invited me in, and before long, we were sitting in his cozy living room, the warmth of the fire contrasting with the chill outside. We talked as we always did, about everything and nothing, but tonight felt different. There was an intimacy in the air that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. As I set my glass down on the coffee table, he reached over to catch it before it tipped.